Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. Welcome back to the National Capital, which has seen a fair share of excitement in recent times. In fact, the last time we were here at the National Press Club on Friday, we ushered in a new Prime Minister as our address unfolded. I can't promise you the same level of drama today, but nevertheless it is going to be a really, really interesting hour or so. Whenever the election is called, and my money is it will be April next year, inequality will be front and centre in the big battle for ideas. We know that because last July Bill Shorten, the opposition leader, gave a very important speech when he declared tackling inequality as the mission of the Labor Party going forward. In fact, he said the biggest threat to the health of the Australian economy was inequality, rising inequality in his view. And that comes, of course, against the backdrop of the decade since the GFC, when Australia is one of only 3 OECD economies not to go into recession. So at a time when we are seeing rising economic growth, when we are seeing affluence playing out in all its many different colours and hues, let's talk about inequality. And today we are very, very delighted to have from the Productivity Commission its chair, Peter Harris, very well known to many people in this room and watching on television, and Jonathan Coppel, Commissioner with the Productivity Commission. They're going to be talking about inequality. Is it rising? How pervasive is it? And what are some of the measures that need to be tackled to address this particular issue? Peter Harris, can I ask you to come and address the National Press Club? Please welcome Peter Harris.
I acknowledge that we meet today on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people. It's a pleasure to be addressing the Press Club here today. Many years ago, I played the occasional game of Kelly Pool upstairs. I generally left my money in the pocket of some member of the press gallery, and it still hurts even today, 40 years later. And a few years after that early start at the Press Club, I spoke to Michelle Grattan upstairs, and she later sent me a book. And it was on the anti-apartheid struggle, which was a bit of a passion of mine. And at the time I was working in PM&C on Southern Africa for Malcolm Fraser. And as a young public servant on receiving this book, I felt deeply compromised. Was I now that fearful object a source? But of course I didn't know anything, or anything much, and Michelle never called me again, so I'm not sure what was worse, the fear of being a possible source or the reality of being too unimportant to matter. And I've come to this very room with Bob Hawke, who delivered my treasured 2.5 sentences about road and rail reform in a 1990 speech announcing a new Commonwealth state process to deal with structural reform in Australia, the Special Premiers Conference, which is the progenitor to today's COAG. They were simpler times back then, no doubt. Problems rose up, leaders dealt with them, even sometimes at great personal cost. Governments changed, but the task of updating public policy mostly persisted. Today the environment is different. We're going to talk this afternoon about multiple stories of inequality and entrenched disadvantage, which some may find hard to link with their preferred concept of the Productivity Commission, despite our track record with disability and aged care and childcare, and now working on veterans' entitlements. But we focus today on this issue because the environment for policymakers is not of that once and simpler time. Context matters if you're in the public policy design game, as the Productivity Commission certainly is. So before we get to the detail of our latest piece of own motion research, let me lay out a little bit of that context. On more than one occasion, Scott Morrison, as our Treasurer, has said to me, there are few low-hanging fruit left in the area of microeconomic reform. And there is surely some truth to that. On the other hand, as economists like to say, not all the fruit back then were low-hanging, by any means. And more importantly today, there is surely an argument that reaching for a higher branch might be a significant political differentiator in this decade's febrile political environment, where ideas float up and then just as quickly pop and disappear. What a standout then would be a commitment to a structural reform plan that had a shelf life of, say, 5 years. there is such a plan. And its principal beneficiaries are people rather than firms, broadening the appeal of structural reform by focusing on higher workforce participation and personal well-being through preventing chronic disease, more adaptable workforce skills through practical improvements to secondary and tertiary teaching, and Hilmer-style reforms to planning and zoning to make it cheaper and easier to live and work in our congested cities. Moreover, this plan is not that expensive, no more than the cost of reform to sharing the GST amongst the states and territories. All of us involved in that only a few weeks ago, most of us probably barely recall what that cost was. And yet the benefits that we assess in this plan are many multiple times that cost, and moreover are perpetual. This plan, released by the then Treasurer in October last year for consideration amongst all Treasurers throughout 2018, is shifting the dial, the Productivity Commission's response to a specific request from the Treasurer on what could be done to address Australia's flagging productivity level. Because it is the case that despite occasional spurts of growth, the engine that drives growth in our economy is sputtering, insufficient to put any power into wage growth amongst many other impacts. Now, for some, this has been a recent discovery, but in my first speech as Chairman of the Productivity Commission in 2013, we made that very suggestion. We said that income growth would fall by about half in this coming decade if productivity performance this decade was as poor as it had been in the previous decade. And so it has proven to be. And this contributes to the general feeling today of dissatisfaction, which the Committee for the Economic Development of Australia, CEDA, found in its April 2018 survey, that 44% of Australians do not feel they've gained anything at all from nearly 3 decades of uninterrupted growth. Now, productivity growth has indeed been in serious decline around the developed world. Australia is not on its own, and probably roughly since about 2004. Enough time surely to show up as being more than a statistical novelty. At the same time around the developed world, but most evidently in the North Atlantic countries, a broad sense of anger and dissatisfaction with the sharing of the benefits of globalism has emerged. The two trends are not linked. Other than that, the ability of governments to respond to the rise of popular sentiment is deeply hampered by being in an extended and unintended low growth phase and having incurred outsized debt burdens during the global financial crisis. Moreover, some of the most powerful and reliable mechanisms of seeing economies return to higher growth, innovation and the removal of trade barriers, are guaranteed to raise the hackles of populist leaders. These solutions thus are not easily advanced anymore, effective though they may have been and still will be in benefiting most of us. And the evidence from our Rising Inequality study, which we'll talk about a little further today, shows just how widely these benefits have indeed been shared in Australia. What we are yet to see here is the kind of angry dissatisfaction expressed in these North Atlantic economies. But we have our own, and not just in the recent past with disappointingly low wage growth. 6 years ago, former Reserve Bank of Australia Governor Glenn Stevens spoke on what was reported then as the glass half full speech. This sentiment, therefore, has been developing for a while. And so, as we look out on the 4th straight decade of uninterrupted economic growth, we need to consider dispassionately why it is that so many of us feel we have missed out. To do that effectively is not to indulge in the hand-wringing of self-criticism. It requires us to show how sound public policy has generally worked for the largest number of us, whilst acknowledging its weaknesses for some. The research we released today on inequality is a contribution to that effort. We show that, unlike North Atlantic nations now caught up in a populist vortex, the benefits of income growth since the last recession in 1990 have been fairly evenly shared across every income decile in Australia. And the bottom decile, the 10% with least income, have done as well, if not slightly better than most deciles. As Jonathan Coppel, our Commissioner who worked on this study, will show later, our tax and transfer system has ensured a sound effort in sharing income growth, and governments of all stripes have generally maintained its effectiveness viewed over 27 years. Now, this will be instantly rejected by some since it's not the popular perception, but it is the unquestionable fact, and moreover, we are clearly not the same as the US or the UK. Now, there are many ways of slicing and dicing income data, and we show some of them in the report. We investigate them in depth so there can be no doubt about the veracity of what we say. Regardless of how it is viewed, decade by decade, or by periods of high and low productivity, or periods of high and low investment, only in the early 90s during the recession did all income groups not experience at least some income growth. But as we also know and must acknowledge, income growth is not the same as inequality. While it's generally used as a comparator between nations, the Gini coefficient, often cited but not as often understood, is not the only way to measure inequality, and Jonathan will take you through that to show what we've discovered in a deep dive on inequality data.
Thank you, Peter. Let me begin with a fundamental question. It's the one that's posed by the title of the report: Is inequality rising? It's a question that draws diverse and competing views. And some of you might be saying to yourself now, yes, it has risen based on this or that metric that you've heard cited. And others might say, no, it's actually fallen based on a different metric. This is not a good position to begin a discussion on inequality and its social impacts. For a serious discussion, it's first necessary to have a thorough and authoritative grip on where we stand today and how we got there. And this is the contribution our report seeks to make, and hence its subtitle, A Stocktake of the Evidence. But it's not a straightforward question to answer. Unlike economic growth, no single metric is going to give a definitive answer. So what we have done is to bring together and take stock of the latest and most complete evidence measuring the level and trends in inequality, poverty and disadvantage in Australia. We did this primarily using household level data and adjusting for the size and composition of the household. And this takes account of larger households needing more resources to achieve the same standard of living as smaller households, and for some economies when sharing living costs. And it is on that basis that we reach our bottom line conclusion that inequality has risen slightly over recent decades in Australia. This is most evident with respect to the distribution of wealth and consumption. The trend in income inequality is more contested territory, however. Some data reveal a small upward tick and others show no change since the early 2000s. Now, one could easily get distracted dissecting the reasons for these differences, but this would blur the bigger picture. The key point is that just looking at the distribution of income in isolation gives you a lopsided view of inequality. And to explain that, a few examples illustrate why. Many retirees, for instance, they live on low incomes but have high wealth. We also know that there are many young adults with higher consumption than income. And on top of that, income patterns alone do not capture the importance of in-kind transfers from government, such as health, education, and government housing. And this is why our approach deliberately eschews the specific and often self-serving use of any one metric of inequality, or make simplistic international comparisons. Now, another reason why commentary on income inequality is contested territory is because the data reveals no uniform trend. It varies over time, and sometimes in unexpected ways. We were surprised, for example, to discover the ABS data since the GFC shows a decline in income inequality. In fact, most of the uptick in income inequality over the past 27 years occurred during the mining boom period, when wages growth was relatively strong. It suggests that growth is no guarantee against a widening disparity between rich and poor. Moreover, and paradoxically, these inequality trends do not square with the perceptions of many in the community. It appears that many Australians are confounding the very modest wages growth in the post-GFC period with widening income inequality. And this again underlines the importance of first assembling the facts. Now, while that perception often is that the glass is half empty, the most accurate picture that can be drawn from the data suggests that each generation is still better than its predecessor. And to reach this finding, we considered yet another way to look at inequality, and that is to dive deeper into the variation in income across age groups. Most often, this variation reflects overall trends in the strength of income. When the economy is strong, all age groups benefit from higher income growth, and when the economy is weak, all age groups suffer from lower income growth. Sometimes, though, some age groups have benefited more or less than others. And most recently, the incomes of young people have grown relatively slowly. But on average, the story is that each new generation has earned more income than the last at a given age and reaches the same level of income earlier in life. Now, a further clear message from the data is that Australia's tax and transfer system substantially reduces income inequality. Relative to other OECD countries, Australia redistributes less income, but we do a much better job of targeting this redistribution to lower income earners. Overall, our progressive tax and highly targeted transfer system lowers the summary measure of inequality of incomes by about 30%. Government-funded services like health, education and public housing have an additional equalising effect. And when you take these in-kind transfers into account in a more expansive measure of consumption, inequality is about 30%, again, lower than for disposable household income. And this is because people with low incomes tend to receive the largest amount of in-kind transfers. While there has been no material change in these equalising effects in the past 30 years, there is nothing inevitable about them either. Now, so far, the inequality measures that have been considered, they provide a snapshot of the distribution at a point in time. While they show a slightly widening gap between rich and poor, that does not mean the rich and poor households at the beginning and the end of the period are the same households. That distinction is important and is why our report also looks at economic mobility, the gauge of whether the rich always remain rich and the poor always remain poor. And it matters because a society with a given level of inequality and where incomes are static faces different and more serious policy challenges than a society with the same level of inequality but where incomes are mobile. A low level of mobility can erode the foundations of economic growth. It can give rise to feelings of social exclusion. And mobility prospects are also an important determinant of life satisfaction and well-being. So how does economic mobility stack up in Australia? There's both good news and bad news. The good news is economic mobility is high in Australia. Most of the people in the top income decile today were not there 15 years ago. In fact, almost everyone moves across the income distribution through the course of their lives. And to give a few examples, over the 16-year period that we considered, the average Australian was classified in 5 different income deciles. There was only 1% of people who remained in the same income decile over the whole period, and 9% of the Australian population spent time in both the top and the bottom income decile over that 16-year period. Now, it's life events such as transitioning from education to work, career advancement, household formation, having children, divorce and retirement. These all underpin some of the observed trends in economic mobility. But policy design also plays a part. Now, I said there was good news and bad news. Now, the bad news is we found the ends of the distribution to be stickier than the middle. Households in the top and bottom 2 income deciles at the beginning of the period were the most likely to be in the same decile 15 years later. That's what I mean by stickiness. This is of particular concern because low mobility at the bottom typically extends beyond earnings to other dimensions of well-being, such as educational attainment and health outcomes. Now, to be sure, some stickiness at the ends of the distribution is to be expected. I won't get into the details of that, as it is somewhat technical. But how much stickiness is too much? Now, that's a question where there's no consensus on how much matters, but international benchmarking provides a basis for comparison. And relative to the United States, for example, economic mobility in Australia is higher overall and less sticky at the tails. And a similar pattern of income mobility holds across a broader range of OECD countries. Another way of summing up is that many Australians experience economic disadvantage at some stage in their lives, but for most of us it is temporary. For this group, sustained economic growth and reliable access to employment will continue to be the source of new opportunities. But another group of Australians experience entrenched economic disadvantage. They are stuck at the bottom end of the mobility ladder. And to explain the nature of this group and what can be done about it, I'll hand the floor back to Peter. Thank you.
So that's my favourite piece of work, that slide. Sorry, can we go back to it? Yes. That's my favourite slide out of the piece of work out of this, because it shows that we are mobile and that we do have opportunity and there's a lot of change. But as Jonathan pointed out, stickiness, particularly at the bottom, is a bother. Now, I'd like to also, in noting that slide, comes from a longitudinal data set, HILDA, run by the Melbourne Institute, of which we have very few in this country by comparison with other countries. We lag badly. And this was one of the themes of our report on access to data and its use in 2017. The government is planning, as we understand it, to put forward and create the concept of national interest data sets, which can helpfully provide us with more opportunity to do this kind of analysis in the future, and that is deeply desirable. But if there's one lesson, therefore, that we're trying to bring out from this report for everybody's benefit, it's this. Despite 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth and unemployment stabilising at a notably lower level in that period, generally starting with a 5 instead of a 7 or an 8, and significant investment in redistribution of income via family tax benefit and childcare assistance in the 2000s, and a boost to indexation of the age pension late in that decade, despite all those things, we still have 9 to 10% of Australians living on very low incomes, half the median income level or less. Now, it's varied a bit throughout that period, but for 2 million or so people, we are where we were 30 years ago. It's not the same 2 million as the mobility data shows, but the proportion of our society apparently doing very poorly should have reduced over that 30 years. Of course, that gross number, 2 million, is a bit misleading because included in that group are many people for whom low incomes have an explanation that does not require a policy response. Students in part-time jobs, small business operators building a capital asset, some older high net worth individuals. But for the remainder, I guess there are expert advisors who suggest we already know the answer to what to do. But after 30 years, perhaps simply shifting money around and doing more of the same is not sufficient. We have measures in this study to show how forms of poverty for children in particular have actually risen over the last 20 years. There are certainly no simple answers to that concept of inherited poverty. So as political parties ask themselves, what are good ways to respond to the popular view that the benefits of growth are not being shared, rather than narrow their search to a preferred or favourable statistical model of inequality, perhaps it might be a lot better to focus instead on persistently disadvantaged elements of this group. It would be a complex task and one for which there are few precedents. We know a bit about this complexity at the Productivity Commission. Aside from the major inquiries I mentioned at the start of this address, in 2015 we undertook a piece of research on housing assistance and employment that focused on public housing tenants and the factors that reduce their employability. The conclusion of that work was that policies need to be much more adaptable to individual disadvantage what I like to call handmade policy. And we completed another report last year on reforms in human services that again showed some innovative ways to address improved health and social service delivery. We increasingly have the data, thanks to digital collection, to be able to improve on this work across a wide range of aspects of disadvantage. We should use it, not bury it. Making a commitment to a comprehensive policy response to persistent disadvantage matters not just because we ought to be able to do better by our fellow Australians as we look out on a fourth decade of uninterrupted economic growth. It matters too because a practical and specific focus on something that represents genuine policy failure in an area as loose and ill-defined as inequality can otherwise allow you, in a public policy development sense, to justify almost any tax or welfare benefit for the better off, or billion-dollar regional development boondoggle, or a leap onto the bandwagon of the new Trump protectionism. Almost any initiative can be justified under such a banner. So it's better to focus on a specific and clear-cut area where we have failed. Finally, shifting the dial, as I mentioned at the outset of this address, our 5-year productivity plan would complement such a commitment to focus on entrenched disadvantage. Shifting the dial's serious structural improvements to human scale gains in responding to things like chronic disease and education and training unsuited to a multi-career job market and expensive, congested urban environments would equip governments, state and federal, facing the sentiment detected by CEDA with another part of the necessary ability to give a clear human focus to structural change and prevent us from being driven by fear to abandon that which we know works, even if it raises hackles to say it. Lower barriers to trade, an active focus on innovation and basic research, and a healthy scepticism about the capability, let alone the efficacy, of governments setting prices or favouring some firms at the expense of other firms and calling it competition. Thank you very much.
Thanks for producing this report. Thank you for that, those really interesting, stimulating points as part of your address. And we're now going to turn to questions from the floor. We've got some of the press gallery's finest economic minds raring to ask the hard and the tough questions. But let me ask the first one as a bit of a Dorothy Dixer, a nice easy opener for you, if I may. This time, last Friday, we had a very good event on this stage as part of the Canberra Writers' Festival, which you all attended over the weekend, I know. We had a very interesting international journalist, Gwyn Dyer, whose book, Growing Pains, examines the rise in automation. In fact, he says the rise in automation is the greatest threat to rising inequality around the world and is contributing to the rise of populism and is contributing to the rise of people like Trump and Brexit, those sorts of things. So we are seeing automation coming in. I read a report today about the introduction of driverless trains in Sydney or in New South Wales as part of the New South Wales government's transport programs. Robots are coming. Will poverty and inequality rise with the introduction of robots and further automation? And what, if anything, can we, Australia, do to try and tackle that particular issue? I might ask you, Peter, to answer that.
Sure. We've done a bit of work on this, so there is some work on research on the Productivity Commission's website for people who are interested in the topic. I think overall, we'd say automation and digitisation are likely to be driven by factors that should, in a net sense, be a benefit to us. Because firstly, you'll introduce them if you're going to, at a firm level, lift productivity, and as I've tried to point out, it is the big generator in the medium term of our ability to pay ourselves more. So that's a very important driver here. Automation won't just be introduced because we've got it. And in fact, you can see that with driverless cars and some of the response to the experimentation in the US. What will instead affect that substantially, and it's particularly true in service industries, and remember they're 70-odd% of most developed economies around the world, will be the response of consumers. so not just safety regulators or people like that, but consumers. If we don't want a robot servicing us, in the end we won't get it as long as we're able to express that preference. Of course, that does rely on competitive markets, because if we've got uncompetitive markets, we won't necessarily be able to express the preference. But on balance, it's not the threat that it's been made out to be, but it does, I agree, feed this populist sentiment. And we can, for students of history, go back to, the original Luddites who were, opposed to the introduction of more efficient forms of cotton spinning. And so, there is a natural fear about technology, but the history of introduction of technology does show that on balance, it's been of benefit to us. So I guess the people who want to say that this time is different are going to have to prove that against a backdrop of where we know with most major economic trends, and you can think of financial markets, the people who say this time it's different mostly haven't been right.
We might move on. Our next question is from Eric Bagshaw.
Thanks very much for your presentation. Is that on? Yeah. Thanks very much for your presentation, Peter and Jonathan. Peter, if I could go to you, you're stepping down shortly as chair of the Commission, and so you might be able to speak a bit more freely about some of the policies that the government is currently pursuing.
People who know me know that I speak freely all the time. That's the bit of humour you've got there.
But are there any in particular, perhaps more drought relief or accelerating tax cuts for small and medium-sized businesses that you would advise the government not to pursue? And secondly, your successor is probably widely seen as a fairly political appointment. How important is it that the PC remains an independent advisor to government?
Nice easy questions there for you, Peter.
Two-part question that I need to remember both parts of. Testing out a bloke who's 63 years old here. Look, in the case of governments responding to a human crisis like drought, and I come from a rural background. My father was a beef exporter from a small country town at a time of fixed quotas and fixed exchange rates. Can you imagine a more difficult business? While I'm not of the land anymore and really haven't been for a long time, I know these circumstances, and it's quite legitimate for governments to test every proposition in trying to respond. But a little like what we just said about entrenched disadvantage, if it hasn't worked in the past, we are, condemned to fail if we keep repeating it. And so when you see subsidies being introduced for the cartage of feed around the country, you look at the history of what that's induced. It's induced higher freight rates and a market response for the higher cost of feed. Now, there is a counter-argument which says, well, we just have to cop that, it's inevitable. But there's a better analysis, and we've done some of it, which suggests that there are adjustment programs that could have been better put in good times, and where we shouldn't just rush to do something because we have to do something. A little bit better thought on the delivery of assistance is, I think, required here. In terms of my successor, look, I wasn't involved, obviously, in any of the selection processes that occurred here. This job, unlike, say, secretaries of government departments, this job, the Productivity Commission chair, requires, almost an unrestricted sense of independence in order to do it properly. Because secretaries of departments are going to do their level best in public to act in a manner consistent with the policies of the government of the day. Behind the scenes, of course, they're going to be providing advice and they're going to be offering critiques, but they're not going to be speaking publicly, as I have today, and as our reports do, and as our commissioners themselves also do from time to time. They're not going to speak openly, secretaries that is, are not going to speak openly as we do. In order to be able to do that, you must have this fully fledged and unrestricted sense of independence. Now, when I came into this job, I succeeded Gary Banks. Gary was what I might call a lifer in the Productivity Commission sense, and I wasn't. So I faced this question from a certain group of people who let it be known that because I wasn't a lifer from the Productivity Commission, I probably wouldn't be the right kind of person to show that level of independence. And remember, I'd been a secretary of 5 different government departments, federal and state, so there'd be a general view that perhaps, maybe I haven't got the sense of independence required either. So I understand that my successor will face this same question. It happened to me. And the way you manage it at the Productivity Commission is actually not terribly difficult because the organisation does it for you. It doesn't matter what idea I bring to the table. There are 2 levels of scrutiny of my ideas at the Productivity Commission. First and most powerful are the staff themselves. You just don't get anywhere by being the highest paid person at the Productivity Commission with your good idea. You just don't. And much perhaps as I might have liked to have, managed that to a more comfortable existence, it's actually in the public interest that that is the case. So your ideas are tested and tortured. And then those ideas go to the full meeting of the Commission, where a couple of us are working on an inquiry, but 7 or 8 other commissioners are just lying in wait to revisit upon you what you visited upon them when their draft report went up there. And so there's another torture process. And so the Commission itself does just what you'd hope in the public interest to ensure that it's a high quality piece of work and it's not just the voice of the chair. One of the reasons why you have Jonathan and me doing this bit of a duo thing today is I thought I'd emphasise that for you. My commissioners, as some of you will know, speak themselves on reports. I've encouraged that since I've been in the job, but just to show you, this is a sort of collective kind of development. So I think independence is substantially supported by our structure, and I think Michael Brennan will be able to perform to the standard that you expect as a consequence of that.
Thank you. Our next question is from Shane Wright.
Gentleman, Shane Wright from the West Australian. I just wanted to go to the report itself. 2 aspects of it. One, you've talked extensively about income inequality and the findings of, say, a marginal increase. But wealth inequality is an area where I think it's fairly clear that there has been a significant change. And I wanted to tease out whether that is an issue that needs examination separate from income inequality. And the other does go to that issue of movement through time and between deciles. And I think you've referenced the fact that at the bottom there is movement, but you only see, say, from the bottom 10, 20%, only about 7% actually get into the top 50% over time. That would suggest a long grind in the bottom half of the income pile for a lot of people. How do you expedite that, and can you expedite that?
Jonathan, would you like to tackle that one from Mr. Wright?
Thank you, Shane. Let me start with wealth inequality. So the report has a dedicated chapter on wealth inequality, and you're right. If you look at indicators of the distribution of wealth, that is one which has clearly seen an upward trend over the past 15 years or so. The level of wealth inequality is about double that of income inequality. And if you compared it with a level of final consumption that takes into account in-kind transfers like education and health, it's about triple the level of inequality. The point I want to remake is that we deliberately look at a set of indicators of equality because we think that each indicator on their own tells a bit of the story, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And if you focus only on the bit of the story, you can very easily get a very lopsided view. So we do treat inequality of wealth in the report, but we also look at other measures, and it's on the basis of looking at those measures as a set that we reach the conclusion that there's been a slight uptick in inequality over the last 27 years. On the movement between the deciles, you're quite right. There is a small proportion of those that are in the bottom decile that move to the top half of the deciles, the top 5. And we make the point that one of the reasons or one of the implications of that is that there's a lot of churning. Even though people may be temporarily in that bottom decile, there's a very high frequency of returning to that bottom decile. And we also look at volatilities of income as one of the possible explanations for that pattern. So there's certainly a high level of churning, and that tends to be at the bottom of the distribution. And I think that is getting towards the group of people that are experiencing entrenched disadvantage, which was the point that Peter made in the latter part of his presentation, that the solutions to that need to be tailor-made and quite targeted to the source of that churning and that source of low income.
Thank you. From Radio 2CC, Mr Tim Shaw.
Thank you, Steve. Tim Shaw, Radio 2CC here in Canberra and a member of the Press Club Board. We've heard a lot about 1,000 jobs a day. We've heard a lot about 1 million jobs since 2013. And then we've heard also about the casualisation of the Australian labour force. Your Deputy Chair, Karen Chester, delivered a very interesting paper in July about that link between training, VET, skills in the Australian workforce. And I'm interested in this idea about either confirming or dispelling the myth of casualisation. What impact, if any, the casualisation of the Australian workforce? Is it more about choice that the worker is looking for? And secondly, this idea of being able to increase one's value to the employer. I think the Turnbull government, I think they were here last week, the Turnbull government was keen to actually see that bounce in increased salaries for Australian workers to come through the small to medium business sector. To both gentlemen, what would you be saying to this Prime Minister, who's a former Treasurer, and his new Treasurer about that stimulus that's probably required to lift wages and to also, I guess, bring together, as Bob Hawke did with the Accord, business union and government together to support Australian workers?
So on casualisation, the data doesn't support the fear that's been promulgated around this being a big threat. It doesn't support that. What the causes are, you referred to the idea that perhaps there's some choice about people remaining in that area, and there's no doubt that through history there has been some choice of remaining in that part of the workforce, and in part it's actually induced by our tax and transfer system. So we have a family tax benefit that does encourage women to work part-time. Now that's not necessarily casual part-time, it's not necessarily the same thing, but that interaction will still exist. I guess the point though in response to your first question is it's not by the data the kind of threat that it has been made out to be. That said, we make a strong play in our Shifting the Dial report for the idea of supporting the kind of investment in education and training that will enable people to move fairly rapidly from job to job, not just because that appears to be their preference, and we've seen all the information that come out from social surveys about whether Gen Y is very keen on this kind of thing, or whichever generation we're up to now. I'm completely out of it as an old bloke. But people do move rapidly, and the outlook is for people to have, if I recall the stats rightly, it's 11 jobs in their lifetime now versus a handful, perhaps. In which case we need an education system that is far more adaptable. And we run the sort of thematic, without being terribly specific about it, in Shifting the Dial of what I like to call the right to return to the education system, where substantially our education system is driven as a sort of one-shot go, You get out of high school, you choose your path, you're in training, you're in tertiary, you're out again, you're in the workforce. If you got it wrong, there's no more job for life with your employer retraining you and potentially shifting you to a different part of a large conglomerate. And how you go back is very, very difficult in that set of circumstance, because quite possibly you've built up some liabilities. You may have a mortgage, car payments, all these things. How are you going to maintain that if you decide to retrain? We don't have a system that is as well designed as it ought to be for what looks like a much more flexible workforce in the future. On small business, do you want to have a go at small business, Jonathan? I can stick with it if you like. Small business, hospital pass. There's a lot of understandable effort that again goes into from governments of all persuasions into trying to assist a sector which is taking, the highest of risks, betting their own personal futures on the possibility of making a sustainable lifestyle in an area where, let's face it, most small businesses are in the services sector. Demand shifts quite rapidly, preferences rise and fall. It is an area of substantial risk and exposure. And so it's quite reasonable that governments would spend time considering, are they impeding people's ability to do this? And should they be doing more? Whether, though, you can rely upon the small business sector to be the initiator of jobs in response to a particular decision by a government to change a tax rate or an investment proposition, that kind of thing, it is a difficult area to work in, because there is sort of no such thing as the small business sector. There's dozens, if not hundreds, of small business sectors, and they will be facing different shifts in demand, and that's the big thing that alters the decisions of a business proprietor. What's the demand profile like for what I'm producing? And would I invest? Would I buy the new piece of machinery under the accelerated depreciation allowance? Those sort of things are going to be affected by demand, and sometimes we don't think about it enough.
Thanks very much, Peter. Our next question is from Gareth Hutchins.
Hi, Peter. You didn't mention anything about gender differences in income and wealth inequality. Can you tell us if you've explored that issue, the gender pay and wealth gap, and what the trend is doing? And imagine a perfect world where there are no politicians. You had control to enact policy. What policies would you enact to reduce the gender pay and wealth gap?
No, you're right. There are a number of areas which we acknowledge in the report we didn't pursue, and that's one of them. Not to say we haven't looked at it in other public policy contexts at the Productivity Commission. So I mentioned our childcare and early education report at the outset of the address I made, and I think I mentioned the interaction with the tax and welfare system, and particularly the benefit that encourages women to return to workforce, but in a particular fashion. So we do sort of, I guess, know something about the complexity, but no, we didn't examine gender inequality in that sense. In terms of policies in response to this, I think, first off and overall, we would want to be sure that we're focusing on something that is amenable to public policy change. As I said earlier in my discussion about the 2 million or so people that are in that bottom 10%, and how that number hasn't varied very much over 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth, and how it probably should have. Some elements of that 2 million are people for whom there is no need for a public policy response. They are students in part-time jobs, transiting, and etc. like that. So when we come to invest in, if we come to invest in policies in response to gender inequality, we should be first asking ourselves, are we responding to something that is amenable to a public policy response? Some of that will be economic, some of it will be in other social areas. Some of it is going to be in better human behaviour, which is, a struggle for public policy to respond to. So I don't have a specific list of initiatives in that area to respond to your question with, but I would like to emphasise that what we do say in public policy design is, be sure you're not just involving the government because somebody should do something. Be sure that you're involving them in a way and a fashion that they can actually deliver an improvement.
Peter, Australia's a nation of property moguls. We, thanks to negative gearing, there are many people in the country, many people in this room probably, who have multiple properties. Labor's committed to tightening up negative gearing. Do you think that would contribute? Do you think a shift in negative gearing laws and a reduction in investment properties across the nation, wouldn't that equalise things out? Wouldn't that actually get rid of some of the inequality that we're seeing with wealth accumulation in this nation?
Well, I'm not sure that that's right, actually, because I think the data shows, I'll look at Jonathan and say, I think it's about 60% of people are actually one way or another exposed to housing prices. So when you first make a shift to a taxation initiative, you should not just think, oh, well, that's investors, we're dealing with them. Obviously, if prices, housing generally are going to change as a consequence of that, we're changing the wealth profile for a good chunk of Australians, and I think that's about the housing investment number if you include all homeowners rather than just investors. So I think you can certainly make a case for targeting tax initiatives to areas where we are being very clear we think there's a need, an identified public interest need to deliver an improvement, and the tax system is the best way of delivering that. So targeting, as I think we acknowledged earlier in our comments, in Australia has been pretty good for tax and welfare. We have thought it through, but we can always do better in thinking it through. And so I think to the extent that there's going to be some further thought in that area, probably it's worth considering.
Thank you. Next question from Tim Colbert.
Tim Colbert from Inside Story, Peter. A million questions to ask you, but I'll forgo most of them. Just to focus on the questions you mentioned of entrenched disadvantage and what is clear in the report, page 14, youth, and how poorly youth have done, particularly in the last 7 years. And I wonder if you could firstly explain why young people have done so badly in the post-GFC period. And secondly, what are the solutions, policy solutions that you see for that and also for those suffering from entrenched disadvantage?
Jonathan, do you want to...
I can take the first part and maybe I'll hand over to Peter for the second part. So I did make the point that there are periods where generations diverge from what's happening across the broader population, and you're quite right. At the moment, youth has been one of those periods of divergence. I think the reason for that lies with a period of adjustment to the end of the mining boom. So we've had very limited wages growth. We've had high levels of youth unemployment in particular. So these are some of the factors that could be underlying that particular pattern that we've identified. We haven't made an attempt in the report to do a comprehensive dissection of what lies below those numbers. We do take some faith, though, that if you look over a longer period of time, they do tend to even out. Well, not yet.
I can add to that. In 2016, we did a report on immigration. And as you know, in immigration, there is this view, which we therefore analysed because it's put to us quite clearly in the course of that report, that the market that's possibly most affected by the employment market that's most affected by immigration, particularly by temporary immigration, might be the youth employment market. And I know work was done internally on this. I wasn't on that inquiry, but they all come through me in the end. And the answer, so this is not to, as it were, duck your question by saying I don't know. The answer is, after analysis, it's simply too complex to be sure that, for example, immigration is a factor. Nevertheless, if there's a part of the employment market where flexibility is at its greatest, it is in that youth employment market. There is an increased supply continuously. It's partly supply from temporary migration, but it's the preparedness and willingness of people to go out to work. It's a generational shift. There's a pressure on kids today to have more things. Mobile phones is a classic example. You've got to pay for it somehow. Either your parents are paying for it or you're going to contribute to that cost. So there is a lot of pressure in that early part of the employment market from additional supply. And I think that's got to have a downward pressure on it. Whether it's, whether you can say, so we've solved it, at least finding the cause, I don't think we should leap to that conclusion. But supply is quite heavy there. Whereas you'll see in other areas of the employment market, the return to skills is going up. It's not probably going up as fast, for example, as for graduates overall, and this is in our Shifting the Dial report. It's not going up as fast as it once did, but there's still a premium for skill. So I suspect that you'll find that that's a contribution, that there is a lot of heavy supply there. Now, if that's right, we should ask ourselves, I'm going to bang on about this, you'll see consistency here, is that amenable to a public policy response? And there may be public policy responses, and our proposition for, certainly for entrenched disadvantage, is this is going to be complex, it deserves a proper consideration. An entity like us, for example, could probably do a serious piece of work in that area if we're asked to do so.
I'm going to keep racing through. Our next question is from John Millard.
Thank you, Steve. John Millard, freelance. Gentlemen, thank you for your very focused address. Neoliberalism in recent times has come under increasing adverse comment, for instance, by Richard Dennis, the Australian Institute, in his most recent quarterly essay. Rightly or wrong, or probably wrongly, the Productivity Commission has been associated by some people, not me of course, but some people, with this neoliberal approach. Given that there is the possibility, remote it might be, but there is a possibility we'll get a change of government where the neoliberal agenda might be less important to politicians. Do you think that this probably incorrect view that the Productivity Commission is, in fact, is that so ideologically oriented, might it be a good thing of publicly acknowledging that it's not?
Peter, I think that's for you.
I was hoping that someone would come along today who could tell me what neoliberal is, so I could, you know, get a fixed handle on whether I am one or not.
Well, I think you need to read the quarterly essay.
What I have read on neoliberalism is definitions are super flexible according to the shock or horror that you want to convey. So I don't think we are a neoliberal organisation any more than we're, I don't know what the opposite of a neoliberal organisation is, but we're one of them either. You know, I've had 5.5 years in this gig. I started out in structural reform in the middle 1980s, was in there for 10 years, went off to deliver different parts of public policy and did a short stint in the aviation industry, which ended very badly, for me anyway, and a lot of other people. You know, I don't come with any ideological preparation. I come with a strong desire for people to convince me by the better use of data that we've got a design here that'll deliver the stated public interest outcome that we're after. And as those who work with me know, I just loathe it if you can't tell me what that stated public interest outcome is. And that's another thing that's really hard to define, he says today, since you've got right out into the philosophical questions, I guess. What the hell is the public interest? The answer is you can't define it until you're given the proposition. Then it's actually quite simple, usually speaking, to define what the public interest is. And the proposition ought to be, show me how we can improve that with a better piece of public policy design, generally using incentives, because down at the micro end, that's what we like to use. You know, there are a number of different incentives that you could apply. So I don't think we're a neoliberal organisation. I could instance all the reports that we've done, which I think the more that definition tightens itself up to something that you can hold on to rather than remaining ephemeral, you think, well, would you have got the National Disability Insurance Scheme from this neoliberal organisation? Would you have got the redesign of childcare and early education, which Jonathan worked on, and Wendy Craik? Would you have got that from this hypothetical neoliberal organisation? My suspicion is, asked that way, the answer is not, but I'm not going to ask people to change their view of us on the strength of my assertions about past reports. I'd like them also to change their view based around what we said today. Because today is a little bit of a, you know, adventurous effort from us, more than might normally be the case, but we think the game is worth it. We want to preserve the things that governments have done over 27 years to sustain serious economic growth in this country, which now, as I pointed out in the address, raise the hackles of certain populist leaders. We want to preserve them, and the best way to preserve them is to concentrate on those things that we have not achieved with those otherwise very useful weapons in support of economic growth, which is, I think, substantially in this area of entrenched disadvantage. So maybe the neoliberal judges can ask themselves this: would a productivity commission classified as neoliberal be coming along today to the National Press Club and arguing for, you know, a root and branch focus on entrenched disadvantage?
A question now from a man who might be able to explain what a neoliberal is, from Crikey, Bernard Key.
Thanks, Bernard King from Crikey. Yeah, I just wrote a book partly on neoliberalism. And the lesson is it means whatever its critics want to blame on it at the time. So, and the opposite of it is paleo-liberalism, I think.
Paleo-liberalism.
It works best.
I thought there was a diet that the Department of Finance had introduced.
I'm sure there's a group of them in the audience, Bernard, you know.
Look, thank you both for your presentations today. Peter, you touched on trade barriers. We're about to hear a lot more about free trade agreements, given the looming one with Indonesia. Australia, we seem to have a tension around the idea of free trade and the messaging of free trade, because on the one hand, there's this rising era of protectionism around the world and protectionist sentiment, including here in Australia with the Anti-Dumping Authority, punishing companies that want to sell us cheap things. But on the other hand, pretty much whenever our politicians talk about free trade, they're talking about the so-called free trade agreements, which are actually not free trade agreements at all, they're preferential trade agreements. And they hype them and they oversell them, and the Commission, going right back to Gary Banks's days, has been very vocal about that. Is there some way we can resolve this tension? Is there some way that we could get politicians to actually talk more effectively about trade barriers and the benefits of liberalisation? And is there any hope for the PC to sell its basic idea that unilateral reductions in trade barriers is actually the way to go, rather than trading them off with foreign governments?
Yes, there is, I think, a way of achieving this. It involves, I'm afraid, persistence and banging away at it. So it's not some kind of immediate solution. But as I pointed out, I think if we can offer that 44% of Australians identified by CEDA the view that structural reform can support, if you like, human delivery of services that are very important to them, particularly in this area of entrenched disadvantage, undoubtedly chronic disease and poor training opportunities and things like that, which are in our Shifting the Dial report, are going to be highly relevant to some parts of that. And together then, you can maintain a commitment to reduced international trade barriers. So that's my general philosophy. On the specific question of these purported free trade agreements, I believe that we're going to get a benefit out of a bilateral agreement when I hear a trade minister utter, in a positive sense, the word import. Because most notably, that doesn't happen. Indicatively, trade ministers go out and bang on about the additional bit of export access we've got for this or for that. They don't really speak very much about what they traded for it. And as we know, there are, in our historical record, demonstrably some very poor bilateral trade agreements where we gave away quite expensive, for our economy, issues on intellectual property in return for pretty nominal improvements in supposed export access. Now, some agreements have been better than that, some agreements have been worse than that, but as long as we have bilateral exchanges that persistently emphasise export and do not realise that if we're importing something, we should be importing it as cheaply as possible, because those small businesses that we were just talking about, as well as the medium-sized and larger businesses, are quite possibly using those imported components or assets. And why should they be paying more for the damn things? It doesn't make any sense. If you were genuinely interested in liberalising an economy and promoting growth, you'd be making sure that both sides of the trade account faced the fewest barriers possible.
And our final, very short question is from Nick Stewart.
Thank you very much for a terrific speech. I was particularly inspired by the beginning, where you said you're going to reach for the medium-high fruit rather than just the low-hanging fruit. But what really got me was that story of you giving money to a journalist. I thought that was utterly terrific, and I'd really endorse that. You referred to, in particular, your favourite graph in here, the significant movement between income deciles. I think that's terrific, but naturally that also captures, for example, the young law student and the young medical student who's not receiving any income at all, who suddenly goes to the top decile. My question is, shouldn't you really be worried about wealth rather than simply income? And isn't that perhaps the area that the politicians need to concentrate on now? Rather than taxing income, tax wealth.
Jonathan, would you like to tackle that question from Mr. Stewart?
Okay, I'll give it a go. Start with the first end of the question. So again, yes, we agree wealth inequality is a lot higher than it is for income or for consumption. A point that I didn't make earlier, which surprised me and may surprise you, is that if you make comparisons of the level of inequality of wealth in Australia with other OECD countries, we actually compare very favourably. So out of the OECD group of countries, Australia ranks 8th, and we're well above some of the Nordic countries, which also surprised me. But then someone pointed out to me, well, maybe that's not such a surprise, because the Nordic countries do have wealth taxes, and that may be one of the reasons why there's less accumulation of wealth. It's also because they have a very comprehensive social support system, so there's less reason to save for a rainy day or for retirement. So these things interact with each other. But I do come back to the point about not focusing on one single indicator, because it does give you that lopsided view. If you look at an individual over time, someone in retirement will have a high level of wealth and a low level of income. That's quite a common characteristic. And I'm not sure whether changing the tax system to try and address that one particular dimension of the story about the distribution of resources would be an appropriate response, given that this thing is so fluid and so dynamic. It's, I think, something that needs to be more focused on that particular group that Peter spoke about, which are the entrenched disadvantage, where I think the sources of the entrenchment are quite specific. They can relate to educational attainment, but they'll often relate to health factors as well. Mental illness is one example of that.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's conclude on that note. Thank you very much, Jonathan Coppel, Peter Harris, for today's address, for tackling some of the big issues. Thank you so much for your report. It is a bit of a novelty having two members of the one government agency appearing here. It's a bit like Simon and Garfunkel coming to the National Press Club. I like it. I think it's got a lot of merit. Let's look at perhaps doing it in the future, whether it's under a neoliberal guise or something else. Peter Harris, this is one of your last gigs, if I can use a musical, before you resign, or retire, I should say, from the Productivity Commission. Thank you very much on behalf of the National Press Club for the service you've delivered to the Productivity Commission and all those other government agencies in the past. To both of you, we wish you all the very best. Please take a copy of Stand and Deliver, which covers the last 50 years of the National Press Club, and includes on the cover Margaret Thatcher, who some might consider the doyenne of neoliberalism, along with her running mate Ronald Reagan. Please thank Peter Harris and Jonathan Coppel.